have heard a lot of really bad writing advice in my time. Some of it, honestly, a minority of it, was things people said to me directly. Most of it is advice that people give to writers as a whole, and some of it is advice that I hear people giving others. So in this video, I'm going to share some of the most ridiculous writing advice that I've heard, why I think it's so important for writers to get really good at discerning good advice from bad advice, and how to sort of do that. Because look, feedback is extremely important when it comes to something like writing. Getting feedback on your manuscript is crucial to actually getting it publication ready. So beta readers and editors are very valuable. Unfortunately, not all are made equal. So that's what we're going to talk about. Also, just a reminder, my second novel, A Song at Dead Man's Cove, which is a gothic horror novel, will be publishing this June 2025. Make sure you are subscribed to my email newsletter at drannayuden.com so that you can be notified as soon as it's out. Without further ado, let's get started. So first, let me just run through some of the things people have directly told me as writing advice. Probably the craziest one I've ever heard is, you can't ever describe the weather. What? This one blew me away. I'm a person who loves to describe everything about the scene taking place, and the weather is one of those elements that can really make a scene more atmospheric. Weather can also be a parallel for what's happening internally with the characters or what's going on in the plot. For example, a storm rising during a climax scene. And weather is particularly important in gothic fiction, for instance, which is the genre in which I write. So when I hear a piece of advice like, you can't ever talk about the weather, in my mind it's like, you're clearly not well versed in the genre in which I'm writing. Because pick up any gothic book, weather will be a big element of it. Another one that I've received is, you should use simpler words, like you should have said building instead of edifice. And I kind of understand where this is coming from in the sense that you should write in the way that makes it easiest for readers to absorb. But I personally love using more literary language, and I think there's absolutely a place for it, because there's just something so satisfying about finding exactly the right word to describe something. A word that's so unique and that most people wouldn't have thought of in that situation, but perfectly fits. I also love learning new words. It's like, I don't know how to describe it. Something about words just tickles my fancy, which is why I'm a writer, obviously. For example, you could say, there were green patches on the stone. Or you could say, lichen modeled flagstones. Lichen tells you exactly what those green patches are. It describes it, and therefore it evokes an image in your head. Modeled also evokes the image in your head. It's kind of like this marbled texture that you see in your mind's eye. But it's a verb that's not super commonly used. And so readers get kind of like a dopamine spark when they realize oh, modeled. Yeah, I know exactly what that means. And that's not a word that I've heard in a long time. Flagstones is a lot more specific than just stones. You understand more about exactly how they look. You understand that they're flat, that they're probably larger than cobblestones. You understand that the stone structure in question is probably a patio or something. So using more complex language can make something so much more specific and therefore so much more vivid and more original. So when I hear advice like that, to me it's like, you're just taking your own preference for what you like in writing and assuming that that's what makes something good writing. Some people like very simple language. That's not me. That's not what I want to offer to my readers. Let's move into some of the more general writer's advice that I've heard. One of them is, you need to have an outline. I don't know why plotters are always trying to enforce their ways onto pantsers. I tend to lean much more towards pantser. I usually have a more rudimentary outline or just a general sense where I'm going, but I decide in the moment what I actually want to happen in that chapter. But I've also on one occasion had a really in-depth outline because of the complex nature of the novel. And in my opinion, there is no difference in the quality. There can be something very intuitive and magical about pantsing, because it's kind of like that is coming straight from the unconscious. But plotting can also give you a really even sense of pace. So I think both have pros and cons, but to act like your way of doing things is the only correct way is so haughty. This next one I heard in a writing course, actually, a writing workshop that I took, that purple prose is always amateurish. You should try to describe things as little as possible. And this one really did a number on me for a while, because purple prose is what I love the most. It's what I love to read. It's what I love to write. The feedback that I consistently get from readers is that the best thing about my writing is it's very vividly transporting them to that place. And so after I heard this, I was like, shit, I guess it's amateurish of me to do this. Let me completely tame this down about myself. And I did that in the manuscript that I was working on at the time. And I was querying literary agents. And I sent it out to a literary agent at one point. And the literary agent said, I was just hoping for it to be a little bit more vivid and atmospheric. And I was like, what? This whole time I was toning myself down because of somebody's subjective preference that isn't even true. And I actually went back to the manuscript and looking back on it, it's so sad to me that I can see how I tried to break up the paragraphs of imagery, and it's I would love to read that. When I see pages and pages of imagery in Elizabeth Kostova's books, Deborah Harkness's books, Maggie O'Farrell's books, that lights me up. That's what I live for. It's so dangerous to listen to people who give writing advice from their own very subjective lens as if it's gospel. Another one I heard is you shouldn't describe choreography during dialogue. Best-selling author Deborah Harkness would disagree. Another one I've heard is you shouldn't ever use adverbs. Again, best-selling author Deborah Harkness would disagree. I've also heard you should always mention who is talking during each line of dialogue. And then I've also heard don't mention who's talking during each line of dialogue. So you get the picture, people will constantly contradict themselves. You will always hear contradictions in the types of writing advice you're hearing because the people it's coming from don't realize how subjective their lens is. Another one that I've heard is you shouldn't write a prologue, which doesn't make sense to me because so many bestsellers have prologues. And to me, it's always a red flag when someone tells you should never do something, but then you go look at the bestsellers and they all do that thing. And up until the manuscript I'm working on now, I'd never really had a big reason or interest in writing a prologue. Before this current manuscript, I went back and added a prologue, and I feel like it really elevated the novel. It really brought up the stakes and the tension. How silly would it be if I had listened to that advice to never write a prologue? And then another piece of advice that I hear often is your novel needs to have insert extremely arbitrary and complex structure in order to keep readers hooked or get published or get a literary agent or whatever it is. First of all, there is no magic formula that will get you a bestseller. Secondly, some of the best novels are rule breakers. Though I agree it's kind of grandiose of amateur authors to assume that will be them, especially on the first go. But writing advice shouldn't be overly restrictive with people's creativity. And also taking such a formulaic approach can really take the creativity and also the fun out of writing. It's really fun to get intuitive ideas and to see how you unconsciously already know the structure of a good novel. You don't need such a formulaic approach. Okay, moving on to advice I've heard people give other specific writers. One time someone was asking in a writing forum, hey, is it okay if I depict this controversial thing? And basically all the comments were saying, no, I wouldn't do that. I don't think you should ever do that. I don't like when books have that. Miss me with that. Anything that happens in real life is fair game to be explored and depicted in fiction. Depicting something does not equal endorsing it. Anything that happens to people is something worth processing in a work of art. So this idea of there are certain taboos that you can never touch, it's so bullshit. And also, this is just a general trend I've noticed, is that in a lot of these writing communities and forums, I am merely a spectator in them because writers can be really toxic to each other. And I've noticed a pattern where the more talented of a writer someone is, where they're copying and pasting a piece of their writing, and you can just tell wow, this person can write, the harsher the feedback they get on it. Versus when there's subpar writing in these forums, there will be dozens of comments praising it to the heavens. And of course, this is subjective. I'm talking about from my perspective. This is what I have observed. It's possible that I'm just tweaking and I have a really bad sense of what's good writing, but I don't think so. I think that writers can be very insecure and ego-driven, and they can get very competitive with other authors. And when they see that somebody's a really good writer, they can start to say some really bad advice. So I would say just be careful trusting the opinions of writers you haven't vetted. So now that I've given you some examples of really ridiculous writing advice I've received, let's talk about getting in the habit of discerning the good writing advice from the bad writing advice. Bad writing advice, I think, doesn't acknowledge its own subjectivity. It assumes that my personal preference equals what makes something good writing. For example, no purple prose, no big words, no prologue, something that's like super subjective that doesn't speak for everyone's experience. Bad writing advice is also not well versed in your genre. I think a person needs to be an avid reader in that specific genre to understand the literary landscape, what's currently performing well on the market, what's considered cliche, what's considered pretty normal. So therefore, if someone's just giving blanket statement writing advice across genres, or they're giving writing advice to a specific author whose genre they don't understand, that can be a problem. Bad writing advice is also way too general. It advises you to always do this or never do that when rules are made to be broken. For example, that you always need to have an outline, or you always need to structure it in this way. For example, there is a rule in fiction that's typically a good rule that you probably shouldn't open with your protagonist waking up. But in my debut novel, The Curse in Their Veins, I needed to open with the protagonist waking up because it had to do with astral projection. And specifically, this character seeing something supernatural while in this midpoint between asleep and awake. Versus what is good writing advice? Basically the opposite of everything I just mentioned. Good writing advice honors your strengths as a writer and cultivates them rather than imposing subjective preferences. It acknowledges its own subjectivity. For example, somebody saying, I wish this were more internal, I found myself struggling to relate to this character. That acknowledges the subjectivity. Versus someone saying, all books need to have a very intimate point of view because that's what makes a good book. Good writing advice is specific to your niche, to your manuscript, to your style as a writer. And good writing advice, when it is more generally geared, often talks more about how to write rather than what to write. For example, it'll talk about the process of overcoming writer's block, tips for doing research, tips for line editing your own work, rather than here's exactly how you need to change your manuscript that I know nothing about. And lastly, good writing advice opens doors rather than closing them. For example, someone saying, it's not that you can't write a prologue, it's that here's how your prologue could be improved, or why this specific prologue is doing your manuscript a disservice. So for this reason, I do not watch general videos on how to be a better writer. They frankly infuriate me. I almost always find that I need writing advice to be specifically tailored to the manuscript in question. And honestly, the best way to become a better writer is not by consuming YouTube videos on how to be a better writer, but by ravenously reading in the genres in which you write. What is the most ridiculous piece of writing advice you've ever heard? Pop it down in the comments. I'd love to read. Hope you have a nice rest of your week, and I'll see you soon.